Hello, and welcome to Varn Vlog Solo. And I wanted to read something from a different Alan Ryan book. This one's on Marx, and political scientists and political philosophers on Marx tend to lack a little bit of sophistication, but sometimes it's useful for getting to a point. This is from Marx, Revolutionary and Utopian by Alan Ryan. Which is a mini book. It's taken from this massive thing that we have been, which is On Politics by Alan Ryan. This is actually a pretty awesome 2 books. Now, I'm going to do what I do here, and I'm going to riff on this for a little bit, but I've been thinking a lot about class collaboration. I've said that all liberal projects, and by liberal, I mean more than just Democrat in the American sense, or labor in the British sense, or substitute your party in the continental European sense, as there are differences between them. But I mean, in the broader sense of liberal project. Liberal projects are class collaborationists because nations require multiple classes to work if your given economic project is capitalist and requires the private ownership of the means of production. And this idea of a polity, of a kind of political organization, is relatively modern. Really does come out of Europe. It is not that there aren't other ethno-typical relations of governance. There's tons. But the idea of a nation state being united by a singular language, and that not being a manifestation of a peoples who speak the language, but of a territory tied to a language. As Joseph Tainer says, you can tell a certain level of complexity has happened when you move from nation or ethnoi to nation state, because you stop talking about King of the Franks and you start talking about the King of France. And France being an administrative apparatus tied to a territory, not to a linguistic people. All right. Now, that's all old news to us, but it's something to think about because the territorialization of nationality also requires class collaboration. And that's because, particularly if you are tied to a territory and you have to maintain the means to defend that territory, you have to set up a class hierarchy to do so, because you need a means of creating a group of professionals to fight to protect your holding of the territory, which you don't necessarily need to do when you are a people who can move around. The territorialization of the world is, while not modern proper, is really kind of a new thing. And for those territories to be tied specifically not to empires who conquered peoples and subsumed them and had coalitions, vassalages, and whatnot, maintaining those coalitions, but tied to nation states that are given political sovereignty as a nation of a people who speak the same language and are tied to a particular territory. That's a modern conception. Now, often we try to read that modern conception back in time. Now, when I say it's modern, I don't mean like it's from the 19th century or so. It's from the 14th to the 19th century as a development, all right, as a replacement for other forms of polities. What Samir Amin calls the tributary polities, such as the Islamicate caliphates, which are imperial, but not in the way we mean them today, are the various governments and polities that existed in the Hellenistic world, or the various empires that existed in India and China, etc. So nation states being modern require class collaboration because it requires classes to generate specialized labor as a matter of complexity. And it requires um, administrative apparatuses which have to get their funding from somewhere, and that funding is productive. Now we can you might go, well, MMT teaches us we don't have to tax to get the money. Well, true, if you can command purchasing power on an international market in any real sense, you don't. Um, but the only reason that your currency holds any value is its ability to be accepted as a tax, which is a power relationship par excellence. So national renewal projects are inherently class collaborative and also mostly liberal, even when they're not liberal in the sense of progressive, like we use the term in America. We have to look at class formation, at least according to Marx, and I might disagree with what Alan Ryan says here, but I think it's going to give us a place to start. Marx's picture of class conflict in the manifesto was binary: owners versus non owners, slave versus free. But classes had two aspects. One was their generation in the productive process, and the other was their role in the political process. If politics is class struggle, we need a clear account of the way the social divisions generated by productive life of society emerge in political life. When Marx discussed actual political events, he abandoned the binary model and appealed to the interaction of more than two classes. His expectations for 1848 were disappointed. Most of the revolutionary energy was nationalist and liberal, not socialist. None of the revolution succeeded. In Germany, the old elites reestablished themselves, and the German unification took place not as a result of a liberal nationalist consensus, but under the aegis of an absolutist Prussian monarchy and its ablest servant, Prince von Bismarck. In France, the July monarchy of Louis Philippe was overthrown, but the Second Republic was unsustainable, and Louis Napoleon was the first elected as president, and after a coup d'etat, turned himself into a self-proclaimed emperor under the labor of Napoleon III. Late in life, Marx came to see that the manifesto mistook the birth pangs of the capitalist economic system in Europe for its death throes. What he thought was an uprising of the socialist proletariat was in part traditional discontent with bad harvest and high food prices and depression. And in the reaction of the workers swept into the urban environments where they felt ill at ease and resentful at the loss of past certainties. The 1848 revolutions were as much backward as forward looking. Marx had little intuitive feeling for the nationalist sentiments that drove the revolution in much of Central and Eastern Europe, and less sympathy. Since working men have no country, he is, or should be, universal in his aspirations. The fact that he is not has always plagued social democratic movements, and some of Marx and Engels' most savage denunciations were leveled as such phenomena as Scandinavian nationalism, dismissed as Old Norse piracy. I do like their sick burns. Soon after Louis Napoleon's coup, Marx wrote an account of the event, later revised to take account of the fact that the coup had been much more than a temporary success that he predicted at the time. That he provided an account of why events had not followed the right scenario and an account of the way in which the state could be something other than the committee of the managing of the common interests of the bourgeoisie that he described in the manifesto. And this, by the way, is why we don't have a good Marxist theory of state, because this theory of state in Du Premier and this theory of state of the manifesto are not so much hostile to one another, but one, the Brumaire, and also in the Civil War in France, is actually much more complicated than the simple phrase for what the state is in the manifesto, which is just a ruling committee of the bourgeoisie. And that views that ruling committee as fairly internally coherent. Right? Back to Ryan here. In France in 1848, there was more actors than a large solid proletariat facing the capitalist bourgeoisie. There was a large peasant population divided between the owners of large land holdings, the owners of small land holdings, and those who worked as agricultural laborers with no land of their own. Marx and Engels had earlier dismissed the peasantry as a bag of potatoes, not a class at all, asterisk, because they were alienated from each other in the way that they were structured in France. It's actually interesting because we don't associate peasants with being alienated from each other today, since they often do have traditional community centers and whatnot that proletarians in the urban environment often don't have. That wasn't necessarily true in the French case, but also we live with a proletariat that doesn't have as many mass production sites because of automation, because of offshoring, but mostly automation, actually. Offshoring played a major role until the automated forces could catch up. A lot of reshoring in the United States, which has been happening, by the way, for 15 years, it's not new, is highly automated and uses a lot less labor. And that's just something you have to deal with. Back to the text. There was large peasant populations divided between the owners of the large land holding and the owners of small holdings, and those who worked as agricultural laborers with no land of their own. Marx and Engels had earlier dismissed the peasantry as a bag of potatoes, not a class at all, and when the peasant votes brought Louis Napoleon to power, they had to change their minds. Nor was there a single bourgeoisie. This is important. This is still true to this day. The division amongst the bourgeoisie and their internal competition, their alienation from each other in terms of competition for ownership, is actually the major driver of liberal politics and the divisions therein. Not, whether we like it or not, the division between labor and the bourgeoisie. Labor, particularly after the decline of the workers' movement, is not usually at the table as a discrete entity with its own interest. It is represented by the interests of the bourgeoisie in which it serves as a sectional right in the economy. Anyway, nor is there a single bourgeoisie. Its upper echelons were divided between those who lived on the state bonds and formed a kind of financial aristocracy and those who were captains of industry. The division between what people will call a productive labor, although that, by the way, is not productive to the social good. It is productive to capitalist surplus value, the valorization of abstract labor. That's the Marxist explanation. Right? It is not productive to social goods. And the financial aristocracy, which drain on the social goods, but may be productive in certain instances because they create liquidity in the economy. So they allow, in some time periods, productive bourgeoisie to be able to leverage the advantage or disadvantage of fluctuating value in time to be more productive in the moment. The problem becomes when there is not enough productivity to deal with the profits sought in the financial sector, which are necessarily rent-seeking in this, based on eating up other parts of the capitalist surplus. Now, does that generate parts of the capitalist surplus? Again, liquidity actually creates the ability for people to do exchange and thus produce. So it's more complicated than a simple parasitic relationship, but one can definitely see how financial aristocracy could be a net drain over time if those loans are not going to productive ends. Below them, and again divided amongst themselves, was the radical petite bourgeoisie consisting of all sorts of desperate characters, ranging from newspaper writers to radical artisans, such as watchmakers, people that we would today see as professionals, because a lot of things that used to be petite bourgeois or intellectia, which is a kind of petite bourgeois, are now employees of corporations, but employees with relative privilege compared to, say, blue-collar workers. The revolution was, to an extent that one group made it, the work of the radical petite bourgeoisie. That is why the republic could not be secured. So we have two pictures of class conflict. One very simple dichotomy between owners and suppliers of labor, and another analysis of what groupings in fact played a role and a decisive role in an important political upheaval. Excuse me, I misread that. The other, an analysis of what groupings in fact played a decisive role in important political upheavals. These two pictures generate two accounts of the state. The first sees the state as an instrument of the ruling class, which is the dominant economic class, and the state manages its common interest. This is not an unattractive view of the politics of the mid-19th century Britain. It can deal with some obvious difficulties, such as the fact that although the dominant economic class was the bourgeoisie, politicians were overwhelmingly drawn from the landowning gentry and their relatives. The gentry politicians can be analyzed as hired help of men busy with making large fortunes. Theory can also cope with the fact that most of the working population was still employed on land or as domestic servants by insisting that the issue is the conflict of the interest that drives political change, not occupational demography. Thus, the whole, canard that you see. Well, we're speaking about the class for itself, not the class in itself. So we don't have to worry about the occupational demography. But the issue is, and this is what one of the many things that actually prompted the Bernstein revisionism crisis, the first revisionism crisis in Marxism, was that the industrial proletariat, even in the most advanced industrial countries, never became the dominant form of proletariat, or if you don't consider servants proletariat, the dominant form of labor. That's still true. Even if you include logistics, which is arguably quasi-productive, Marx actually has a long time trying to work this out in Capital Volume 2. But what you actually see is the productivity of services is hard to gain. And the distinction, like when we talk about the great barista gate between services and commodities, whereas, by the way, your coffee is a commodity. You consume it, but it's a commodity. It's a consumable commodity. So the barista is part of a production process. It's not just a service, but we think of it as a service because we think of low profit margin, single instance consumable products, because they can't really be sold in the commodity market beyond that as services, even though they are products. I want you to think about the implications of this for a while, because it comes up in a lot of dumb debates about what Marxism is, and that's because people aren't dealing with the ambiguities we're here dealing with today. And I will talk about what this means for class collaboration and the seeming dominance of the liberal project. Many things Marx thought a state seen as a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie would do happened as they ought. The Victorian state became uncorrupt, rooted in secures and jobbery, and set up a meritocratic system of recruitment. Property law was made simpler and more transparent, and restrictions on the sale of land were abolished, reflecting a shift away from the preserving land within a family and towards allowing all assets to be made into liquid capital. And that is important. During large parts of the past, you could not sell land. It was technically the king's prerogative that you had it in the first place, and thus it was illiquid. Turning non-liquid assets into liquid assets has been a primary goal of capitalism, because it also, in many cases, allows you to turn things that are purchases into rents. Anyway, the Victorian state fit the theory because the theory was drawn from it. Indeed, one way in which it frustrated Marx's expectation was by doing such a good job of managing the interests of the bourgeoisie. It averted revolution, incorporated the urban working classes into a political system, then seduced the workers with the spectacle of empire. And it's the beginning of discussions of labor aristocracy, although it didn't initially mean first world workers. That's not what it originally meant in Marx and Engels, or even later. It meant workers who had privileges, usually through union benefits and maybe through government contracts, etc., in the pool of workers. And this was most likely to happen in the imperial cores. Not a term they would use, a term we use, but nonetheless. It forced the owners of the industry to behave in their own best interest by regulating factory conditions and hours of work, and protected the wages of male heads of the families by restricting the employment of women and children. Until we undid that in the 1970s. Not with women. We're undoing children now, apparently, in the Southeast, anyway. But it's not just in the United States. Far from suffering immiseration, the English working man had a half a century of rising real wages. This was destructive of Marx's hopes of revolution, but it did not wholly subvert his political theory. If Marx had thought that through his account of the common interest of the owning classes, he could have seen that they included not only things that he did mention, such as the enforcement of laws against theft and fraud and the interest of everyone on average, if not the thief or the fraudster on particular occasions, but also things that he did not, such as the regulations that stop firms from competing in ways that would provoke political unrest. After all, political unrest is a threat to the dollar or the pound or the franc. Pick your poison. The euro today. The price of arguing in this way is to give up the claim that revolution is inevitable. But Marx doesn't want to do that, but he hedges his bets. Revolution was inevitable only if the government botched the job of securing the common interest of the bourgeoisie. Two escape routes are worth mentioning. One is to dismiss everything an intelligent government might do as short-term palliatives, doomed to fail in the long-term run. For example, when the worldwide competition began to threaten British economic supremacy and British firms could not compete with the firms in other countries paying lower wages, British firms would have to drive down wages, and the manifesto scenario of immiseration leading to revolution could come into operation. The other is the abandoned idea that it is encapsulated in the slogan that social evolution proceeds by the means of political revolution. Revolutions have been the rule because the excluded classes have lacked peaceful ways of representing their interests and pressing for change. The incumbent ruling class is seen an issue as a zero-sum game. For lower classes gain in power and wealth, the incumbent upper classes would lose what the lower classes gained. In a more prosperous world with rapidly growing productivity, a gradual improvement in the lot of the workers and the closing of the differences in income, power, and aspirations and culture between classes could see a peaceful transition from full-blooded old-fashioned capitalism to democratic socialism or capitalist welfare state democracy. Late in life, Marx thought that Britain, Holland, and the United States might take that route. Marxist acknowledgement of this possibility suggested some disillusionment with his useful view that the revolution alone would slough off the muck of ages. He's still pretty adamant about revolution, my dear Dr. Ryan. Marx's second theory of the state was adopted in France, Germany, and Russia rather than Britain or the United States. Was adapted to France, Germany, and Russia rather than Britain and the United States. After the Revolution of 1848, Louis Napoleon found it easy to rally support from enthusiasm for the army and military glories of his uncle Napoleon I. There was also many people with vested interest in the continued existence of a military bureaucratic state as such, just like we have with the military industrial state now. Or we might actually call it the military industrial bureaucratic state, because that's kind of what it is. Not only the bondholders and job stockers who made their livelihood lending money to the state and selling the state bonds to other people, but also substantial bureaucratic apparatuses had stake in the preservation of the French state. Since the revolution had not destroyed it, it could put down insurrections in the streets of Paris and Lyon and turf out parliamentarians opposed to Louis Napoleon. Under the conditions that the state ceases to be the committee hired and fired at the will of the bourgeoisie and turns into an independent actor. Does it, though? And this is a good question, because this is a question that is highly debated in all questions of the national question. If the state is an independent actor, how collaborationist is it? And this is one of the things I want us to think about. And then its nature is hard to explain in terms of a simple theory of class conflict. If any state that regulates a capitalist economy is a bourgeois state, then its two salient properties should be the cheapness and the focus on the common interest of the bourgeoisie. The French state engaged in the pursuit of national glory, which is not cheap and not obviously in the interest of the capitalist. It employed a swollen class of officials who did not come cheap, and it issued a lot of government debt whose interest payments required taxes that many of the bourgeoisie did not want to pay. even though others wanted the income they provided. The explanations of the existence lies in the answer to the question, just as the common interests of the bourgeoisie are. Marx thought that the French bourgeoisie had never established its position as a ruling class. The division of the economic interest between the financial and industrial bourgeoisies was one element, and the vigor of the radical bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie was another. The state had never been captured by the bourgeoisie. The state's personnel could therefore pursue their own parasitic interests as a social class living off of the state. Marx also claimed that the divided bourgeoisie needed a stronger state than the undivided bourgeoisie would have done. The class as a whole needed a strong state to enforce the common interest of all property owners against the separate interests of particular forms of property. It is not a foolish argument. One could imagine representatives of different bourgeois interests sitting down to devise a state to which they would all be loyal and coming up with a military bureaucratic regime that Marx described in France. If they were sufficiently cynical, they might also divide its propensity for military adventures that distracted attention from domestic affairs. But they would have been ill-advised to advise anything that culminated in the disaster of the Franco-Prussian War. When he first analyzed the particularities of Louis Napoleon's coup, Marx said his successes would be short-lived. He had assumed the bourgeois state of the manifesto was the normal form of the bourgeois state, that the expense of the military bureaucratic state would be intolerable to an industrial and commercial bourgeoisie. He later saw that the deviant form of state had more staying power. One effect was to lead him to think that there might be more roots from capitalism to socialism than he had anticipated. Maybe, I'm not so sure that I agree with Ryan here. And that the revolution in a literal sense was not only possible precursor to socialism. So let us turn to the last elements in Marxist account of politics, the theory of revolution, the withering away of the state and the social organization thereafter. Marx was a tremendous non-finisher of the work that he had projected. Oh my God, yes. That was not idleness or intellectual disorganization. It was the inevitable outcome of his ambition to create an intellectual system that would do full justice to all the phenomena in which he was interested. Since he proposed to tackle the nature of the state at the end of the sequence of investigations, which the 3 volumes of Capital would have only formed the first quarter, and here Ryan is agreeing with Hal Draper, only 1 volume of Das Kapital was published in his lifetime. It is easy to see why we have mere fragments of the project. So we have a tension here. We have the competition between classes and the collaboration between classes creating the state as seemingly an agent independent of class actors. Seemingly though. And we have a real functioning bourgeois state with a fairly united bourgeoisie, i.e. Victorian England, that is more interested in the rationalization described by Weber than it is in things like acquiring lands for rent seeking, and this sort of thing. For the Marxists, this leaves us in lurch, and it leaves us in lurch in a way that has been unresolved. And I think this unresolution needs to be dealt with. Marx says that the proletariat knows no country, but that since it has to act in its national form first, because that's the national arms of the states, and since we don't think the states can be collapsed all at once, we have to use the states as they currently exist at any time in which we are acting, which means that we have to deal with both the national development project and taking over and subsuming it and stay internationally aligned. But the tensions with that are obvious, and they've been obvious since 1914. It's one of the central contradictions in the room that conservatives throw at us. But the problem that this gets to, not just for the Marxists, which is, that we're talking about here. And again, we might not agree with all of Alan Ryan's assertions. I don't. But I think his basic description of the trajectory and the 2 theories of state that one could get out of Marx, the one in the Brumaire and the Civil Wars in France, and the one in the Manifesto, they are different visions of the state that actually did accurately represent, at specific times, I may add, different visions of development. But today we see the United States is a lot more like France and Russia and its developmental path, with more and more financial sectors seeking more and more things, obscure regulations, all kinds of hybrid class positions and intervening classes, enough so that someone like Eric Olin Wright has to go in and intervene and try to come up with a theory of class that makes it all work, or someone like the John and Barbara Ehrenreich trying to come up with a new theory for a new class, the PMC, which combines two other hybrid classes: the professionals, who are basically labor aristocrats in old Marxist term, and the managers, who are also labor aristocrats, are bourgeoisie with some relation to labor because they also draw a wage, or the petit bourgeois, who had priorly been the primary people who were professionals, but as professionals get bought out and proletarianized, they get patronaged by the state. This is actually discussed pretty well by Kristen Parentley in an article in Compact Magazine from about a year ago. This confusion means that almost everything we do involves either being delusional about elements of the state, like people pretending there's still a mass industrial working class in the developed world, hoping that places from the less developed world can overthrow the yoke for everybody, even though they're in an even weaker social position. Not dealing with the implications of automation, for the fact that you're not going to have large social formations and factories anymore, so the efficiency of factory union membership is no longer going to be there. You have to deal with highly fragmented working class. It's a lot more like that sack of potatoes, or as friend of the show Matt Chrisman has said, Pringles in a can that we have today. We are a lot more like the peasant isolated in France, working on our own labor and relatively small collectives, even though we draw a wage for most of the time, than we are, people working in mass industrial factories in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And that's been true since before digitalization. That comes back with just old mechanical automation. As the Euro-communist, who eventually abandoned the working class, talked about in the 1970s and 80s. So there's a complexity question here. How do you simplify elements of the state so that you don't need as much highly specialized labor? Or, to put it another way, while individuals may still specialize in their labor forms, that you don't need whole castes of people to do so, and that there's relative ability to move between forms of labor, and not requiring huge and massive amounts of specialized training. Because specialized training requires somebody to support those people while they're getting trained. And since we want people to be economically mobile in the system and still have highly advanced functioning, we have to look at what that requires. This leaves us in a lot of lurch. One, it means that most of our political projects are still going to be both class collaborative and dominated by money. And because they're dominated by money, there's a limit to what we can really do. There is a moneyed left. There is a, quote, left of capital. Although I don't love that phrase, because that implies that there's a left that's not part of capital. And outside of a few AAS countries, that's just not true anymore. Also, most of the AAS companies are doing their trading on the world capitalist economic system. They're not just trading it with each other, and they are collecting surplus value. So they're participating in a capitalist economy in the world scale anyway. You can make the decision about whether or not you think that makes them a capitalist. I'm not here to get in that semantic debate with you. My point is that least element of it is a fact, and a fact you have to deal with. So if all the liberal projects are class collaborative and often based on trying to leverage the kind of incoherence we see in Louis Napoleon in facile and kind of pathetic ways that you might see in the various LARPing politics of today, and various candidates that cannot win, and even candidates who can but cannot rule as they would see fit and freely, then we have to ask ourselves a question. What about the nature of class collaboration has made it so dominant today that people who will borrow theories of class collaboration in the developing world to justify class collaboration in the developed. Why has that become the most dominant position? And why can't people see that that will limit your ability to do work? Conversely, if we don't acknowledge that fact, we can pretend to make peons to the working class that are meaningless. Literally, they're just rhetorical constructs. We don't know who we're aiming at except some future class for itself that does not currently exist. We are not dealing with the divisions of the class in itself today, and thus we cannot really do a whole lot. This is a fundamental tension, and it's one that you have to deal with. And it's a fundamental limit to what we've seen in Marxist organizing. And if you don't see this pendulum swinging between these kinds of orientations, social democratic movement moving into Marxist Leninist movement, both get frustrated, begin to die. Some anarchists come in the room, in the foyer, something happens, a crisis happens, the process starts over again. When the crisis happens, it's tied to an economic cycle, but very quickly, as the economic cycle is resolved, the pattern goes back to a political cycle. So you see these patterns based around elections, not around money, are not around money in the sense that we saw the rebirth of Marxism in 2007, 2008, and 2009 as around a worldwide recessive crisis. But this is not supposed to happen. So the question that we began with in the beginning, how does classes that emerge out of the tensions of production becomes classes that deal with themselves and fight in the realm of politics, still becomes unclear, even in our own movements in the Anglophone left today. This is why I often mock national developmentalists in the developed world as decadent. Because if they weren't acting decadently to a decadent situation, aka the decomposition of loss of our capital through bad investments and parasitic shareholder schemes, um, we would not be in this situation, but we are also symptoms of that decadence. We cannot escape it by volunteering, thinking that just having the right ideology is going to get you out of it. That's actually an idealist framework. You know, ideas matter, but they don't dominate. There's a material limit. And I emphasize this over and over again. But if we continue to not even try to develop class independent organizations, we will never even begin to see if we have a way out of this crisis or not. We will remain captured, and most of the working class will be politically inert. Not politically irrelevant, but they're a force treated by many people as a kind of an inert force that other factors, petite bourgeoisie, the big bourgeoisie, the state, etc., can take advantage of and utilize, but never has its own fully articulated agency because its own internal divisions and inability to really access power rule it out from being so. And you see this in models in Peter Turchin and people like that, Michael Lind, etc. The other truth is left and right politics both speak to different contradictions in the average working class person's life. And until we deal with that, and that we can't generalize because a few working class people we know are liberal or conservative, but this is coming out of deep social contradictions that aren't easily reconciled by those political and cultural valences, we can't escape it either. The problem that you have is when people try to address those political and cultural valences, the only way they know how to do it, and this actually is defensible, but it's also why we have to harp on it all the time, is both collaborative and tailism, to try to follow people where you want them to go, and that is following people who themselves are trying to collaborate with people already in power and hoping that through making allegiances with people in power, their own interests will be made manifest. I hope this makes a lot of things clearer to you, as well as why a lot of current politics, not just left politics, politics in general, are spectacular dead ends. Because the bourgeoisie is decadent. But we have to not just complain about that decadence. We have to complain about less than just the short-termism of Philoton Valley, or more than just the short-termism of Philoton Valley. Like, we have to look at why that would ever be incentivized in the first place. What in capitalism does that? Why does this drive for profits lead people to do things that actually undercut the profits in the long term for gains in the short term? And is this endemic to capital? And are there different societies who are worse at it? And are there ways to control finance without trying to eliminate it? And can you pretend to have a productive economy without a finance economy? Doesn't seem like that's possible, right? The contraction of profitability does seem to happen when you're not able to leverage time, and it requires finance to leverage time. What interest in all that's about. I hope this makes the current predicament a lot clearer to a lot of people. I don't think I've actually stated it this clearly before, and I do think understanding the paradoxes of Marxist development and not trying to come up with this simple, almost great man idea of an epistemic break, but dealing with the material realities of which Marx was drawing his ideas from. His project is necessarily unfinished, and it was rooted in particular times and places. And if we don't know that, we can't do anything with that. And the attempt to just deduce from text what that is a difficult thing, particularly when you don't have similar understandings of the meanings of the words, what the programs implicate, or any research or political implications thereof. It is both a degenerated research program, but more importantly, it's a degenerated political project. We have to ask ourselves, it's 2024, and people felt more hopeful about the left in 2016 than they had in a generation and a half. And yet we've seen that fizzle away faster. I mean, the new left to the new communist movement to its death in the early 80s and the dominance of movement conservatism across the political spectrum, that took 30 years. We have done something similar in 10, 12, 3 election cycles. And that's not just the United States either. It's more terminal and more obvious in Britain. And they have a more organized working class, but one that is getting crushed and not getting that many runs. And it's going to manifest as more reactions in all kinds of directions, both what leftists continuously call reactionary in ways that we don't see too. These tensions will be exacerbated. The idea that immiseration dictates the political response was always too much hope. You have to be in a position to give a narrative to take care of both the objective and the subjective conditions. And if you're not, you don't have a whole lot to stand on. Like and subscribe, keep your peace. And remember, politics is more than your thoughts about it.